Hello and welcome to Getting Your Money's Worth, the show that focuses on value. I'm Judith West, and our guest today is John McWhorter, Manhattan Institute scholar, fellow, author, teacher, and man about town. Okay, is that all right to introduce you that way?
That's perfectly all right. It's pretty
Hi,
accurate.
John. Thanks for being on the show.
No problem.
Right. You write a lot and have written lately a lot more about the political scene and change.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking about change, I want to go to something right here in New York City. The New York City Education Department began issuing report cards to all New York City schools, grading them. What's your opinion of that?
I think that it is a wonderful thing. And of course, there's been a great outcry along the lines of the fact that sometimes the grades seem to be arbitrary, and inevitably the system is going to be imperfect. So some excellent schools or schools that are making great improvement are going to get grades that are maybe lower than they should. And that's the way things have to go. But all the people who are complaining don't seem to have any real suggestions as to what they would do otherwise. And so if you're not going to grade the schools, are we just going to go back to the flailing that we were doing before?
Well, let's talk about how these grades are going to be used. For one thing, they're going to be used for performance bonuses for teachers. They're also going to be used as a criteria for principals' continued employment. I come from the business world, John. Sounds pretty good to me, frankly.
Appropriate.
Frankly. Why are parents of all constituencies protesting?
Yeah, well, of course, some of the protest is due to the fact that if a school has been graded badly and if there's some danger that the school is going to be taken away, naturally there are feelings of discomfort. Naturally there are feelings that the school was doing better than it was. And then there are also a lot of protests just coming from, of course, the teachers' unions and people running the schools themselves. And it's understandable that if you see your world possibly crumbling around you, that you're going to protest. But what people don't understand is that there does have to be accountability, and that there do have to be standards, and that has to be something that's measurable. The question is how you measure things, and for a lot of people that just becomes a stumbling block.
But you know, every other industry on the planet is measured by productivity. The only industry that seems to have missed that piece is education.
Well, people will say that you're teaching to the test, and so the question is how do we have tests that everybody would think were appropriate? And that's a really nasty knot that we have right now, because I think we all know that tests do mean something. Then on the other hand, we also know that they don't mean everything. I say that a test that's imperfect is much better than what was going on before.
Than nothing.
But we have people who disagree with that.
While we're talking about the education, I don't want to leave this yet. Last week, or maybe it was even this week, I think it was even this week, in the New York Times, Bob Herbert had an article about what he called the continued blight in this country. And he spoke to the education gap between urban students, minority students, and others. Also today, CNN released a poll that said 92% of Americans don't think any presidential candidate is speaking or cares about education. There are folks who think that education should be the civil rights issue of the moment.
And what a lot of those people don't...
Why isn't it?
Isn't it? Is because it's a tough problem. So, for example, Bob Herbert, about once a year, writes an op-ed where he implies that the problem with inner-city schools is that there just isn't enough money or that the teachers aren't good enough. I wonder if Bob Herbert has spent much time in the sorts of failing schools we're talking about, where, for reasons that the kids cannot control, the behavioral problems are such that one of the main problems is just getting people to sit down and shut up and listen. And that's not a matter of whether or not you're a good teacher. There's no magic bullet in terms of how to address that. So obviously, Democrats are not addressing these problems because the teachers' unions are in their pockets. And I think Republicans are, at this point, just baffled. No Child Left Behind clearly isn't everything, but I think they're letting that be the babysitter for the moment.
Well, speaking of No Child Left Behind, if it did nothing else, John, at a bare minimum, it called attention to the problem. It introduced the word accountability into the education industry.
And also a racial aspect.
And the racial aspect of No Child. So for that, we have to thank them. On the money issue, if we're not spending enough, how much is enough?
And of course, none of these people look at all the studies, all the times where you've poured money into failing school districts and nothing happened. There's this dream that if Uncle Sam would just let go of the cash and fund these schools, then after, I don't know, 5 years, 6 years, they'd be like schools in Scarsdale. Again and again, in New Jersey, in Kansas City, various places, they've done exactly what, say, Jonathan Cazal wants us to do in his book, Savage Inequalities, and nothing happens, which shows that we're not just talking about money and stinginess. It's something larger and unfortunately more complicated.
Right. And really, and it's kind of a solution that doesn't, or a problem doesn't seem to come up with a solution.
And that's the hardest thing.
And that's the hardest thing. I think that's the hardest thing for caring people to understand is where's the solution. You've written about, as I say, you've written about politics, gender, race. I'm concerned with a little bit of a bigger issue. I called you scholar, man about town. You know, you've been around a long. You know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
What is the problem here in America? We don't seem to be able to find candidates that are worthy of of running the country that we have been and want to stay.
And I think that we're at the point where we have to realize that, again, as seems to be the theme of our conversation, something is better than nothing. And as far as the candidates go, I think this year the Republican crop is not terribly exciting, although it's nice to see McCain getting more attention lately. And among the Democrats, I should say openly that I am a fan of Obama. There is a notion that because I work for the Manhattan Institute that I must not like him. But I think that the symbolism for him, mostly because of the race issue, would help heal that divide in this country. The notion that a lot of people have that the color line is still our biggest problem, I don't think it is. And I think that Obama in the White House on Air Force One, raising kids in that White House with his black wife, would change the terms of our race debate in a way that I don't think anything else could at this point.
Yeah. Is that enough to satisfy the kind of problems we have? Should we as rational adults, or would you, say that it really doesn't matter whether you have experience? It's okay to get OJT in the White House.
I think that in this case, the kind of experience that, say, Hillary Clinton has is not so long and deep and successful that it makes Obama look like a pipsqueak. It's not as if she's been, running things at a high level for 30 years. She's watched a lot of things, but I don't think the gradient is enough to matter. Yeah. And something, Judith, I'll bet there are people who say this every 4 years. This is the 4-year interval where I'm saying it. We need inspiration. We need a jolt. There's a real malaise right now.
We do. We need inspiration.
There's that Kennedy-esque quality about Obama. I've never seen that in my 42 years. Maybe it's because it's my first time. I was not mature enough. I missed Kennedy completely, never saw RFK. I was like 3 when he died. This is the first time I've seen one of those magic people. And so that's why I found myself having allegiance to him as the proof.
Speaking of all of this, I didn't really know until I read this also in this morning's paper. I don't know what I'm going to do when print goes out of style. I think,
which is happening right now.
Which unfortunately is happening right now.
Online is real.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to be dependent on Manhattan Institute completely for everything I know. I didn't realize that this country is 149 out of 163 countries, somewhere between Chad and I forgot the B country, in terms of the amount of voters, voters that vote.
Yeah.
That vote.
It's pretty scary, isn't it?
It's pretty bad.
Although,
it's really, you talk about, we talk about the education gap, we talk about the income gap, we talk about all these other gaps. What we rarely talk about is the voting gap, how few Americans vote that are capable of voting. And it's partly because we're such a large country. It's partly because we have such a diffuse sense of national identity. But that problem is real. I think Obama could help it. But for example, in New Jersey, where I live, how's it go? The primary, you had to register to vote in the primary by January 15th, a week ago now. That wasn't exactly trumpeted, and so if you miss that, that's it. You're not in the primary. It's too hard to vote, considering all the obstacles. There are too many loopholes. It was rooted in a good idea to be sure that there was not voter fraud.
Of course, yeah. But
I'm not so sure now that it's not just kind of one of those bureaucratic carryovers.
And because voters, political junkies are not a critical mass of voters, we need it to be something something that registration should be something you can do more passively and more at the last minute than was the case 50 years ago. So we need reform along those lines.
John, you write a lot, you speak a lot, you're respected.
Am I respected?
How? Well, in my crowd anyway. I don't know about your crowd. Speak for yourself.
It depends.
How do you deal with frustration when it seems as though it's so hard for anything positive to take a hold and move forward? Do you have those?
Yes, I do.
Those feelings of frustration and those feelings of a lack of inspiration. How do you keep yourself inspired? We have folks watching us. Let's leave them with some inspiration of how to stay inspired.
There are two quick things on that. One, it's easier to believe that change happens slowly than wrong, that's not the way the aphorism goes. It's easier to believe that change doesn't happen than to believe that change happens slowly. And I think to myself, these things are incremental, and I try to be very historical. What was it like 8 years ago on this score? And often you'll find that there is an improvement. It's just that you can't see how there's going to be some massive improvement in a year. And also I think we tend to think of progress too much in terms of how things are for us, whereas in terms of especially the issues I write about, I look at the new generation. And I think, so, okay, there's this problem and that problem for people who are about 42 like I am. But look at these people 17 and 18 in the world that they live in. That's not just race, but all sorts of things. And I often find as much reason for hope as pessimism. But yeah, one must be patient in this life.
And I suppose that that's the key word, patience. Speaking of hope, you know, really, there are lots of folks think that the biggest way to give everyone, more people, hope in this country coming up, especially generations, is to work on this education gap.
That is true.
Personally, I think that there's been a lot of progress in New York City, and hopefully this will, hopefully this will trickle out.
That's right.
Any last words of wisdom for our audience?
I would say that in terms of words of wisdom, this issue about incremental is very important. And also to know your history and to realize that we do live in good times.
Well, after all, speaking of incremental and speaking of history, you and I are talking to each other in, you know, conversational way on a medium that is going to be available 24/7 around the world. So what could speak more to change than that?
Think about how that has changed the fabric of existence. It's kind of scary sometimes, but think about how easier.
A little ominous too.
It is.
How easier, right?
That's right.
It keeps you on your toes what you're going to say.
It sure does.
Right.
Being in the media is completely different now than it used to be. Because you're on there for the rest of your life.
Right.
That's right.
It's like email. Whatever you say, it is forever.
It is. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's scary.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, too.
Thank you for watching. You're watching Getting Your Money's Worth. I'm Judith West, and we're with John McWhorter.